London, 1882. A candlelit drawing room. Hundreds of young people competing for a single glance, and a woman who wanted none of them. She stood in the corner of the room, alone, thinking of a book she had left at home. He was the most coveted man of the season, and despised every second of it. Neither of them wanted to be found, and that was precisely why they found each other. But between them there was more than the resistance of two stubborn hearts. There was a mother who moved pieces on the board like a queen in chess, a cousin with plans that had never been asked for, and a rival who kept secrets capable of destroying everything. What begins as an imposed choice will become the most genuine decision either of them has ever made. If you love stories like this one, with tension, elegance, and hearts that resist before they yield, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next chapters, and tell us in the comments what draws you in most about period romances.
Hello, I want to introduce myself to you. I am Miranda Lake, the author of the stories you already follow on this channel. I am a woman like so many others who loves historical romance novels. I am married, a mother, and a grandmother. I was a child with a vivid imagination and have always loved reading from a very young age. Books transported me beyond the quiet life in the countryside. I read many children's and young adult classics by Brazilian and foreign authors. And as I matured, I grew to love books even more, especially historical romances. I always imagined myself writing beautiful love stories for dreamy women. But only now, in maturity, is this desire becoming a reality. I just released historical romance novels on Amazon, whose covers are shown in this video. See the book descriptions via the links I've included in this video's description. I hope my books and my videos can keep you company during your moments of rest. Now I invite you to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss other exciting stories like this one, and leave a comment telling us what you love most about historical romances.
London, 14th of March, 1882. The Montague ballroom sparkled with the light of hundreds of candles arranged in crystal fixtures that hung from the ceiling like clusters of luminous ice, and the sound of the violins filled the air with a waltz that seemed to have been composed expressly to make young ladies sigh. Ladies spun in their gowns of silk and taffeta, fans beat with an almost musical cadence, and gentlemen in black tailcoats bowed over hands wrapped in impeccable white gloves. It was, by any reasonable measure, a perfect evening for those who enjoyed such events. Harriet Ashbourne did not enjoy balls. She never had. She was leaning against the most discreet column in the room, the one positioned between the second window and the sideboard bearing the champagne glasses, and wore an expression that her cousin Claire would later describe as the face of someone solving an arithmetic problem. The grey-blue muslin gown she wore was clean and well kept, but bore no resemblance to the splendour of the other young women's dresses. No triple flounce at the hem, no train sweeping the marble floor, no artificial flowers sewn to the bodice. It was the dress of a woman who had come out of obligation, not delight. "Harriet, for heaven's sake, you might at least pretend to be enjoying yourself," said Claire Thornhill, appearing at her side with 2 glasses of lemonade and an expression of gentle desperation. Claire was her cousin's perfect opposite. Fair hair neatly arranged, cheeks flushed with excitement, blue eyes scanning the room with the systematic hope of someone searching for something precious. Lord Davenport looked at me twice, and Mrs. Hutchins said, "The youngest Greystone boy is looking for a wife." "Twice, Harriet." "How lovely for you," said Harriet, accepting the lemonade with a sincere but brief smile. "And how lovely for the Greystone boy, I presume." Claire looked at her with that particular mixture of affection and exasperation that develops only between cousins who have known each other since childhood. "You're thinking about that book, aren't you?" "The one about Elizabethan medicinal herbs." "About 16th century medicinal plants in general," Harriet corrected, with a precision that was entirely involuntary. And yes, Harriet's father, the Reverend Thomas Ashbourne, was a man of unshakable faith and very variable income. The modest ecclesiastical living he administered in Derbyshire was sufficient only to maintain a degree of dignity, but not enough for dowries, expensive dressmakers, or long London seasons. Harriet had come to the capital only because Claire had insisted, and Claire had insisted because her Aunt Millicent, Claire's mother, believed with an almost religious fervour that a London season would resolve all the existential problems of a girl of 23. Harriet had her doubts about this thesis. What she possessed in abundance, however, was the curiosity that her father had transmitted to her, and that had been developed through years of voracious reading in the parish library. As the room revolved around her, she observed the people with the same analytical interest with which she studied botanical texts, the invisible hierarchies that manifested in who greeted whom first, the calculated glances of mothers positioning their daughters like pieces on a sophisticated chessboard, the body language of the few men who wished to dance but awaited social permission to do so. On the opposite side of the room, seated in a high-backed chair that appeared to have been transported there expressly for her, sat the Duchess of Renmore, Eleanor Renmore, a small and compact woman of 62, with white hair combed with mathematical severity and a dark silk gown that cost more than the Reverend Ashbourne's annual living. She had not danced in 15 years and felt no regret for it. What she did, and did with consummate skill, was observe. And she had been observing the young woman by the column for nearly an hour. It was not her beauty, though the girl was pleasant, with neatly arranged brown hair and an upright posture that suggested discipline rather than affectation. It was certainly not her dress. It was the indifference. The Duchess had seen hundreds of young women feign indifference over the decades. She had learned to distinguish performative disinterest from genuine disinterest, with the precision of a jeweler confronted with dubious stones. And that young woman was real. She was not waiting to be noticed. She was, quite literally, somewhere else inside her own head. "Mortimer," said the Duchess to her secretary, who remained discreetly 2 steps behind her chair like a well-dressed shadow, "find out the name of that young woman, the one by the column." Mortimer found out in 6 minutes. The Duchess took another 20 to decide. When Claire was swept onto the dance floor by an enthusiastic cavalry lieutenant, Harriet was left alone with her lemonade and her thoughts about medicinal plants. She did not see the lady approaching. She did not notice when the lady settled into the chair beside her, the only vacant chair in that corner of the room, with the careful elegance of someone who conserves their movements. She only became aware of the presence when she heard the voice. Low, precise, with the quiet authority of one who has no need to raise her tone in order to be obeyed. "You are the daughter of the Reverend Ashbourne, of Derbyshire." It was not a question. Harriet turned and found the Duchess's eyes, perceptive, without hostility, but also without the warmth one might expect from a casual exchange between strangers at a ball. "Yes, ma'am," said Harriet, because the education her father had given her included answering with precision when an elderly lady addressed her. "Harriet Ashbourne, you have not danced once this evening." "No." The Duchess tilted her head slightly, as though the confirmation of something she already knew was somehow satisfying. "Nor did you attempt to." "There was no reason to attempt it," said Harriet, and then felt the impulse to explain herself, because the declaration had sounded ruder than she had intended. "I mean, I have no acquaintances here who might present me, and it does not seem proper to request a dance on my own account." "But you might have positioned yourself so as to be approached," said the Duchess, with the objectivity of someone merely recording a fact. "The other young ladies do so." Harriet looked at the room and then back at the lady. "Yes," she agreed, "they do." There was something in that reply, in the absence of excuse, in the absence of embarrassment, that made the Duchess's lips move in an expression that very nearly became a smile. She rose from the chair with the same economy of gesture with which she had settled into it. "Good evening, Miss Ashbourne." "Good evening, ma'am," said Harriet. Only when Claire returned from the dance floor, flushed and happy, and Harriet asked whether she knew the woman with whom she had been speaking, did she discover that it was Eleanor, the widowed Duchess of Renmore, matriarch of one of the oldest and wealthiest families in England, and that her son, Lord Edmund Renmore, was considered the most inaccessible match of the season. Harriet looked at the spot where the Duchess had been sitting, and then turned her eyes to the window, to the March night outside, and thought that there was probably something very interesting waiting for her in that book on medicinal plants at home. She did not imagine, not for a single instant, what had been set in motion in that quiet corner of the ballroom. 16th of March. The news reached Edmund Renmore in the most irritating manner possible, at breakfast. He was seated at the table in the dining room of Renmore House. a room the size of the entire Derbyshire parsonage, with a ceiling painted with clouds and cherubs that had always struck him as excessively optimistic for a space where practical decisions were made, with the Times open before him and completely ignored when his mother entered. The Duchess of Renmore had the gift of entering a room in such a way that the entire atmosphere reorganized itself around her. Edmund had grown up watching this happen in drawing rooms, sitting rooms and libraries, and had developed a considerable resistance to the effect, though not complete immunity. He folded the newspaper with deliberate care. "Good morning, Mother." "Good morning." The Duchess sat at the opposite head of the table, accepted the cup of tea the butler offered her, and examined the eggs with the critical expression of one who holds elevated standards regarding scrambled eggs. "I have made a decision." Edmund felt that sentence settle in the air with the specific weight that his mother's decisions always carried. They were not suggestions, they were not opinions. They were declarations of a state of affairs that she had determined, and which the rest of the universe was invited to accommodate. "Regarding what?" he asked, because asking was more efficient than waiting. "Regarding your matrimonial situation." Edmund set his coffee cup down with more precision than was necessary. He was 31 years old. He had inherited the dukedom at 23 when his father died of pneumonia in a particularly cruel winter. And he had managed the family's estates, investments, and responsibilities with a competence that even the most exacting creditors could not question. He was, by any objective measure, perfectly capable of making his own decisions, including matrimonial ones. "Mother," he said with the tone of one who has had this conversation before, because he had, a great many times. "You are 31 years old," said the Duchess, as though he might have forgotten. "The line of succession depends upon you. This is not a matter of personal preference. It is a responsibility." "I am aware of my responsibilities." "Then you must act accordingly." She drank her tea with the composure of one who knows she holds the stronger argument. "I have found her." There was a resounding silence. Edmund looked at his mother. His mother looked at the scrambled eggs with a serenity that was, in itself, a form of provocation. "Found whom?" he asked, though he knew, with the cold certainty of one who knows an adversary well, that he would not like the answer. "The suitable young woman, the daughter of the Reverend Thomas Ashbourne of Derbyshire. Harriet, 23. The Duchess employed her fork with surgical precision. She was at the Montague ball the night before last. She did not dance once. "You are telling me you have chosen a wife for me on the grounds that she did not dance?" "I am telling you I have selected a candidate based upon a series of observations that you, had you been present, would also have made." The Duchess looked at him directly for the first time since she had entered the room, and in that look was the clarity of a woman who had navigated London society for decades without ever losing her bearings. She was not attempting to impress anyone. She was not positioning herself. She was not calculating. While every other young woman in that room was competing for your attention, for the attention of a man who was not even present, she was with her own thoughts, entirely indifferent to the spectacle. Edmund was silent for a moment. "And that makes her suitable as a duchess." "That makes her interesting," said the Duchess, "which is already more than I can say of most." Edmund rose from the table with the controlled composure of a man who had learned at considerable cost not to display irritation before his mother, because his mother interpreted irritation as confirmation that she had touched a sensitive point. "I will not be arranged like a commercial transaction. No one is asking you to be. I am merely suggesting that you make the young woman's acquaintance. You do not suggest, you determine." "Edmund." His mother's voice was soft, but there was steel beneath it. "I would be far more direct if I wished to determine. I am asking you to meet a young woman who struck me as extraordinary, nothing more." He looked at her for a long moment. The Duchess drank her tea with the placidity of a woman who knows she has already won, even though her opponent has not yet realized it. Edmund took the newspaper from the table and made for the door. "Where is she staying?" he asked without turning. "With the Thornhill family in Belgrave Square." He did not reply, but he did not say he would not go. Harriet was in the library of the Thornhill house when the card arrived, and library was a generous term, for what was essentially a sitting room with a bookcase. She had spent the past 2 hours trying to ignore the sound of the embroidery that Aunt Millicent practiced with an enthusiasm inversely proportional to her talent. She had found a volume on the history of Gothic architecture which, though not precisely what she wished to read, was infinitely more interesting than the conversation the others were having about Claire's cavalry lieutenant. Aunt Millicent read the card and produced a sharp, inconclusive sound, half a shriek, suspended in the air. "Lord Edmund Renmore wishes to call tomorrow at 2 o'clock in the afternoon." Claire went still, needle held in mid-air. Harriet continued reading about pointed arches. "Harriet," said Aunt Millicent with the intonation of someone conveying information of the utmost urgency, "Lord Edmund Renmore wishes to call upon you. Here, tomorrow." "Yes, I heard. Do you know who he is?" "The Duchess's son," said Harriet, for she had made a few discreet inquiries after the ball, and research was, after all, an ingrained habit. "The current Duke of Renmore, one of the oldest families in England, quite wealthy by all accounts, very disinclined to marry by what London society discusses with a consistency that I should consider excessive." Aunt Millicent looked at her with the expression of someone uncertain whether to laugh or to weep. "And you are telling me this in the same voice you would use to tell me the time of the train to Derbyshire." "It is the information I have," said Harriet, quite reasonably. Edmund arrived the following day punctually at 2, which Aunt Millicent interpreted as an extremely positive indication of character. Harriet interpreted it as the standard behavior of a man who managed estates and had a practical sense of time. He was tall, taller than she had imagined, though she was not certain why she had imagined anything at all, with dark hair and shoulders that the dark grey wool coat rendered all the more evident. There was something in the way he entered the room that was not precisely arrogance, but the specific assurance of someone who rarely found himself in an environment where he did not have control. He was clearly not enjoying being there. Aunt Millicent served tea with a nervous efficiency that resulted in biscuits sliding from the tray. Claire smiled at the Duke with the rehearsed smile of one who had been instructed to be agreeable. Edmund responded with a flawless courtesy that contained no warmth, and then his eyes went to Harriet, who was sitting with the straight posture that was natural to her, hands in her lap, looking at him with an expression he took a moment to identify. Curiosity, pure and simple, as though he were an interesting phenomenon she was mentally cataloguing. "Miss Ashbourne," he said, taking the armchair he had been directed to. "Lord Renmore," she replied. Aunt Millicent filled the cups with a concentration that suggested the tea was the most important thing taking place in the room. Edmund drank his tea and looked at Harriet. Harriet waited. "My mother tells me you spoke at the Montague ball." "Briefly," said Harriet. "She asked me why I had not danced." "And what did you reply?" "The truth, that there was no reason to attempt it." She tilted her head slightly. It did not particularly impress her, I imagine. There was an honesty in that which was almost disconcerting. Edmund was accustomed to conversations in which every word was calculated, in which young women said precisely what they believed he wished to hear, and every gesture was a small piece of a larger strategy. This woman was simply saying what she thought, with a composure that seemed entirely removed from the absurdity of the situation, a duke sitting in a drawing room in Belgrave Square to examine a candidate for wife whom his mother had selected at a ball, based on criteria he had not yet fully understood. "You know why I am here," he said. This, too, was not a question. "I have a reasonable hypothesis," said Harriet. "Your mother is a very determined woman." "Yes," he replied. Harriet then stated, "And you do not agree with her initiative." Edmund set down his cup. "Frankly," she confirmed, "I always prefer frankness. I do not agree. I dislike being managed like an item in a property inventory." He looked at her directly, and there was something in his eyes, dark green with an intensity that Aunt Millicent on the other side of the room would probably classify as ardent passion, but which Harriet correctly recognized as controlled irritation. "However, I came because the alternative was to give my mother the satisfaction of knowing she had unsettled me sufficiently to refuse." Harriet looked at him for a moment, and then something happened that Edmund had not anticipated. She smiled. Not the calculated smile of drawing rooms, not the polite smile of young ladies trained to please. It was a genuine smile, brief, that arrived and departed with the naturalness of an involuntary expression. "That is the most honest thing anyone has said to me since I arrived in London," she said. Aunt Millicent, on the other side of the room, appeared on the verge of fainting with anxiety. Claire had stopped pretending to read. Edmund looked at Harriet for a long moment and felt, for the first time that afternoon, something that was not irritation. "You did not want me to come either," he said. "I did not," she agreed. And there was something in the lightness with which she said it, without drama, without games, that was, Edmund realized with a mildly uncomfortable clarity, genuinely refreshing. They sat in silence for a moment, and the silence was not awkward. Outside, birds sang in the plane trees of Belgrave Square, and the distant noise of the city entered through the window like a continuous bass note, and Aunt Millicent produced the soft sound of someone attempting not to make a sound and failing. "May I ask you something?" said Harriet. He was curious. "Of course. What did your mother tell you about me exactly?" Edmund considered offering a diplomatic version. Then he remembered that she had said she preferred frankness, that you were not trying to impress me. "And that persuaded her I would be suitable as a duchess." "It appears so." "She was not wrong in the observation," said Harriet, "but she drew a somewhat hasty conclusion from the premise." Edmund was, against all expectation, mildly amused. "Do you think so?" "Not attempting to impress a duke I do not know does not make me suitable for the position of duchess. It makes me merely—" She paused, searching for the right word, "indifferent to the ball," which is, apparently, rarer than it ought to be. There was a different kind of silence this time, not merely the silence of the absence of words, but the silence of two thoughts that had arrived at the same place at the same moment. Edmund rose, and there was something in his movement that was less tense than when he had arrived. "Good afternoon, Miss Ashbourne." "Good afternoon, Lord Renmore." He went to the door and stopped. There was something, a hesitation he himself could not have named. "Until when are you in London?" "Until the end of April," said Harriet. "My cousin has social engagements." "Ah." He nodded, in a farewell that was neither exactly cold nor exactly warm, and left. Aunt Millicent waited until she heard the street door close, and then released the longest and most meaning-laden sigh Harriet had heard in years. Claire threw her arms around her cousin with such excitement that she unsettled both their hair. Harriet remained seated in her chair, looking at the window where the light of the March afternoon gilded the branches of the plane trees in Belgrave Square, and thought that the Duke of Renmore was more interesting than she had anticipated, which was not, necessarily, a simple thing. 19 to 28th March. Mrs. Dorothea Fenn was the most widely read social chronicler in London, and her weekly column in the periodical The Voice of the Season had the specific power to transform a mere encounter into a scandal, or a scandal into entertainment, depending on how she felt on Thursday afternoon, which was when she wrote. She was 60 years old, wore extraordinary hats, and possessed a network of informants covering every drawing room, every tea, every park, and nearly every corridor in Mayfair and Belgravia. In the edition of 22nd March, between a note about the Countess of Hartwell's new hat and an observation about the young Cavendish men who appeared to have forgotten that public gardens have witnesses, Mrs. Fenn wrote, "A discreet call was made in Belgrave Square by Mr. W., whose name requires no additional capitals to be recognized. The young lady called upon, of clerical and modest family, appeared neither particularly surprised nor particularly pleased by the visit, which, under the circumstances, is the most fascinating of commentaries." Harriet read the column at breakfast with the expression of someone discovering an equation with more variables than expected. Claire read it and became so agitated that she spilled her tea. Aunt Millicent read it again, and then folded the periodical with that specific energy of one containing an explosion of satisfaction for reasons of dignity. The Duchess read it and was satisfied. Edmund read it and was irritated. Harriet was primarily curious about how the information had reached the chronicler so rapidly, about what other movements were being observed that she had not noticed, and about what exactly, neither particularly surprised nor particularly pleased, said about her own feelings that she herself had not perceived. The second encounter took place in Hyde Park on 23rd March, and from what is known, it was not planned, though Edmund suspected his mother had arranged it by some means he could not prove. He was riding along Rotten Row when he saw Harriet walking the adjacent path with her cousin and a maid, and there was something in the way she walked, with that firm and direct step that was neither masculine nor careless, simply efficient, that made him turn his horse before he had made the conscious decision to do so. He dismounted. That had not been planned either. "Miss Ashbourne." She turned, and there was on her face that expression he had noticed in the drawing-room, the genuine curiosity without artifice. "Lord Renmore, your horse is beautiful." Edmund looked at the animal, a 6-year-old bay called Boreal with an excellent temperament and an ego proportionate to his size, and then back at her. "Thank you. Have you ridden him since he was young?" "Since I was 4 years old." He paused, for it was not the sort of thing he usually said spontaneously to strangers, but there was something in her question, the direct interest. Without frivolity, that made the answer natural. "Why do you ask?" "The way you dismounted, without thinking, like someone who has done something so many times that the body simply acts on its own." She looked at the horse with the same analytical attention she applied to everything. That must be liberating. Claire, beside her, had developed the expression of someone watching something she did not entirely understand, but instinctively recognized as important. She was discreet, which was, for Claire, a considerable effort. "Do you ride?" Edmund asked. "Poorly. The horses in Derbyshire are practical rather than elegant, and my father needed them more for parish work than for riding." She said this without a shadow of the apology he might have expected from a young woman of limited means. It was merely information, like any other. But I enjoy observing. They walked together, without anyone having formally suggested it, simply because Edmund had dismounted and was walking, and Harriet was walking in the same direction, while Claire followed at a distance that was simultaneously decorous and strategic. Edmund spoke about Boreal, and Harriet asked questions that demonstrated she had read about hippology at some point in her life, which was the sort of thing Edmund had not expected from a conversation in a park. "You have read about horses?" he asked, with an inflection that bordered on incredulity. "I have read about many things," she said, with a simplicity that was neither modesty nor pride, merely the mention of a fact. "My father's library has more gaps than volumes, but what it does have is interesting. Like the book you were thinking about at the Montague ball." She glanced at him sideways. "Your mother told you that?" "She said you were somewhere else inside your own head," I interpreted. Harriet was quiet for a moment, with that thoughtful attentiveness he was beginning to recognize as characteristic. "16th century medicinal plants," she said. "I am trying to understand the difference between what the herbals of that era described as curative and what modern medicine, such as we have of it, confirms as efficacious. There is a greater overlap than one might expect." Edmund was also silent for a moment. "That is," he searched for the word, "specific." "Yes." There was a slight smile at the corner of her mouth. "Most people say unusual. You were more generous." "I was not generous, I was precise." The smile deepened slightly. Edmund looked ahead along the path stretching beneath the plane trees and realized he had walked further than he had anticipated and was, in some way he could not clearly identify, less irritated than he usually was. That in itself was unusual. The days that followed brought what Mrs. Fenn would call in the edition of 29th of March a series of extraordinarily well-distributed coincidences, including a tea at the residence of Lady Thornhill, where Edmund appeared on the pretext of business with Mr. Thornhill, a visit to the art gallery where Harriet was studying a Flemish painting with the concentration of one solving a difficult problem, and an afternoon in Kensington Gardens, where the Duchess had organized a picnic under the false pretext of it being a spontaneous gathering. The Duchess observed her son conversing with Harriet with the discreet satisfaction of one seeing a hypothesis confirmed. There was something happening there. She could not yet say exactly what, it was too early, too contained. But there was. Edmund did not look at the young woman as he looked at the other candidates society had presented to him over the years. It was not desire, not yet. It was that rarer thing, genuine interest, what the Duchess had not anticipated, and which Mortimer, her secretary, began to perceive before she did, was Lord Cyril Ashbourne. Harriet's cousin arrived in London on 25th of March with that specific energy of one who comes from afar, with purposes he is not disposed to declare directly. Cyril was the son of Harriet's eldest uncle, the only branch of the Ashbourne family that had maintained some degree of prosperity, relative though it was, through reasonably well-managed investments. He was 35 years old, with a smile that reached his eyes only when convenient, and a very particular vision of what the Ashbourne name needed in order to restore itself to the social relevance it had lost 2 generations past. A cousin who became a duchess would serve those purposes very well. He presented himself to Aunt Millicent with all the affability of a man who knew how to maneuver in social spaces, and the aunt, who was too kind-hearted to distrust relatives without clear evidence, received him with satisfaction. Harriet, however, received him with the more cautious reserve she had always felt towards her cousin, without being able to articulate precisely why. It was something in the way he framed questions, as though each question were in fact 2, the one being asked aloud and another, smaller one, hidden beneath. "So it is true," said Cyril, seated in the drawing-room with a cup of tea and that smile that reached his eyes as needed. "Renmore is calling." "He made one call," said Harriet. "Singular. And a walk in the park, and a tea, and—" He gestured with a lightness that was not careless. "Harriet, you understand what this means, don't you?" "I understand that there was one call and a few casual encounters," she said carefully. "Nothing beyond that." Cyril looked at her with that specific expression of one about to be helpful in a way that had not been solicited. "It takes a great deal more than that to secure his interest in a lasting way, my dear cousin. He has a reputation for being cold, calculated. He does not allow himself to be drawn in easily. You would need—" He paused, as though choosing his words, "a strategy." "I have no interest in strategies," said Harriet. "Having no strategy is itself a strategy," said Cyril, "but one that may fail if a more skilled young woman appears with the right resources." There was something in that which was simultaneously logical and wrong, like an equation that produced the correct result by the incorrect method. Harriet set her cup back on the tray. "I am committed to being exactly what I am, Cyril. I cannot be anything else, and I have no intention of trying." Cyril looked at her for a long moment, with an expression she could not completely read, and then the smile returned. "Of course," he said. "That is exactly what I am saying. Be yourself, simply another light wave of the hand. Be yourself on the right occasions." Harriet did not like that. She did not know exactly what she did not like, but she was left with that thought throbbing in her memory, like a knot in a line that ought to have been smooth. The dinner at Lady Whitmore's house on 27th of March was where the tension of unspoken things began to take shape. Edmund was present, at the Whitmores' invitation, as they were family friends, and Harriet was there because Aunt Millicent had received the invitation with a promptness suggesting it had been facilitated by someone. And Cyril was there as well because he had casually found himself overhearing Aunt Millicent mention the event, and had quickly ensured he was included with the fluency of someone who knew how to gain entry everywhere. At table, Harriet sat 3 places from Edmund, too far for direct conversation, near enough to exchange glances over the wine glasses, and Cyril sat beside her, a position he had maneuvered into with a subtlety she only noticed afterwards. During the first course, Cyril spoke about the Renmore family estates with a detailed knowledge that Harriet had not asked for, but which he provided regardless. The acreage, the annual revenues, the known financial commitments, the debts discreetly mentioned in certain circles. "How do you know all this?" she asked, quietly. "I research what concerns me," said Cyril simply. Across the table, Edmund had noticed the conversation without hearing its content, and there was something in the way the man leaned towards Harriet, with that calculated proximity the dining table required, but which could be calibrated in varying degrees, that made him feel something he identified, with some discomfort, as distaste. It was not jealousy. It could not be jealousy. He had made one call and had a few casual encounters with a woman his mother had chosen. There was no commitment, No declaration, no rational reason for jealousy. It was merely distaste, an aesthetic objection to the panorama. After dinner, while the men drank port in the smoking room, Edmund stood by the window beside Lord Whitmore and looked out at the lantern-lit garden, and thought that the season was becoming considerably more complicated than he had anticipated. The following day, when the Duchess asked him, with her characteristic brevity, whether he had reached any conclusions, he said, "Not yet." But there was something in the way he said it, a fraction of a second's hesitation before the words, that made the Duchess set down her teacup with a satisfaction that she attempted, with relative success, to conceal. Mrs. Fenn, that same morning, was writing about the young Miss A and her remarkable ability to appear precisely where Mr. W will next be found. It was an unfair observation. Harriet had arranged nothing, but unfairness was, in Mrs. Fenn's opinion, frequently more interesting than the truth, and interesting was precisely what the season was becoming. First fortnight of April. The April rain beat against the windows of Wrenmore House with an insistence that Edmund had learned to associate with difficult conversations, because London rain had the habit of appearing precisely when one needed to think clearly. He was in the library, the only room in the house where he felt at ease, with an estate management report from one of the Yorkshire properties open on the table, but completely ignored, when Mortimer knocked at the door with that particular knock which meant, "There is something requiring your attention, and it is not an office matter." "Yes, Mortimer?" The secretary entered with the posture of one carrying uncomfortable information, and doing so as well as possible. "My lord, there is a matter concerning Miss Ashbourne that you may consider relevant." Edmund closed the report. "Go on." "The young lady's cousin, a Mr. Cyril Ashbourne, has been making discreet inquiries about the financial situation of the Wrenmore family, about the terms of the late Duke's will, and—" Mortimer paused with the delicacy of one who knows the pause is necessary, "about the possibility of negotiating a retroactive dowry in the event of a marriage contract." The silence that followed had texture. "He is negotiating a dowry before any proposal has been made," said Edmund. "It would appear so, my lord, through intermediaries, informally, but with a consistency that suggests it is not mere speculation." Edmund was silent for a long moment, looking at the rain that streaked the window in oblique lines. There were two possible interpretations. Either Harriet was involved in her cousin's maneuver, which contradicted everything he had directly observed of her, or she was not, and the cousin was acting on his own initiative, with a degree of presumption that was, objectively, extraordinary. The question was, which of the two was true? "Thank you, Mortimer." He went to find her on 3rd of April at Lady Whitmore's weekly tea, which had become the regular event most likely to include them both, without either of them having arranged it. Harriet was by the window with a cup in her hand, listening to a middle-aged lady speak about a minor scandal involving someone's children, with that expression of polite attentiveness that was not genuine interest, but was too well bred to show it. Edmund waited until the middle-aged lady was distracted by another conversation. Then he went to Harriet. "I need to ask you something directly," he said without preamble. She looked at him. "Then ask." "Your cousin is negotiating the terms of a possible marriage contract on your behalf. Did you know this?" The silence that followed was not the silence of someone searching for an appropriate answer. It was the silence of someone processing unexpected information with the precise speed of an analytical mind. Her expression moved through several things in a fraction of a second. Surprise, then a contained anger she did not entirely conceal, then that cold clarity he had come to recognize as the manner in which she functioned when something needed to be resolved. "I did not," she said. The simplicity of the reply carried the weight of certainty. "I have your word on it." "You have my word, and the coherence of what you have observed me to be up to now." She set her cup on a nearby table with a care that suggested an effort of control. "If I wished to negotiate strategically, I would have begun negotiating at the Montague ball. I was not doing so." There was something in that which he immediately knew to be true, not because she said it, but because it fitted with precision everything he had observed. The irritation he felt was not with her. It was with the situation, and with the cousin. "Mr. Ashbourne appears to be a man with plans," said Edmund. "My cousin has plans for a great many things," said Harriet, with a dryness that was the most controlled form of anger. "And a generous conception of his own importance in the affairs of others." Edmund looked at her for a moment. "Will you speak with him?" With great clarity. She spoke with him that evening in the Thornhill drawing-room, after Aunt Millicent and Claire had retired, with the discreet efficiency of those who have been gently but firmly requested to do so. Cyril sat with the composure of one prepared to be confronted, and with arguments ready. "You had no right," said Harriet in a low voice that carried more weight than if it had been raised. "I had the interest," said Cyril with a reasonableness more irritating than open opposition. "Harriet, you do not understand how these things work. A proper dowry is not dishonor, it is protection. A well-structured contract protects you, protects the family, establishes—" "You do not represent the family in any matter that concerns me," she said. "You were not authorized, not consulted. Your father would have done the same." There was a difficult silence. Harriet knew this was not true. The Reverend Ashbourne was a man who believed dignity more important than stratagem. But there was in that phrase the specific cruelty of a lie. "My father did not do so," she said, "and had he attempted it, I would have said the same as I am saying now. No." Cyril looked at her for a long moment. The smile had gone. What remained was a more honest and less agreeable expression. "You are being naive," he said. "Renmore will not propose out of intellectual admiration. He needs a functional duchess, a family alliance, a social agreement. You need security. This is a transaction, Harriet, not a romance." "Perhaps," she said. "But it is my transaction, not yours." She went to bed with the solid certainty that she had done the right thing, and the less solid unease that her cousin had said something she did not know how to entirely dismiss, not because she believed it, but because there was in that phrase the shadow of a question she herself had not yet answered. What did Edmund want, after all? She discovered part of the answer on 7th April, in a completely unexpected way. The visit to the Royal Botanical Society had been Claire's idea. She believed intellectual environments were romantic, and the Society had received a donation of 16th-century medicinal plant specimens, being catalogued by the curator, an enthusiastic man named Dr. Caldwell. Harriet had heard about the donation by chance, and had asked Claire to accompany her with the urgency of one who has at last found what she was looking for. Edmund was there because Dr. Caldwell was a friend of the late Duke, and because the Society received an annual contribution from Renmore House, which Edmund maintained out of respect for tradition, and primarily because Mortimer had mentioned, with his characteristic discretion, that Miss Ashbourne had confirmed her attendance. They met before a Flemish herbarium of 1562, its pages smelling of thyme and dust, and both Edmund and Harriet were entirely absorbed in studying it at the same moment, without either having immediately noticed the other. "The annotations are different from the English ones of the same period," said Harriet, without turning, for she thought she was speaking to Dr. Caldwell, who had been at the other end of the table a moment before. "The Flemish schools of botany had access to Mediterranean specimens that the English did not," said Edmund, for he had heard Dr. Caldwell make exactly that point in a conversation a few minutes earlier. There was a silence of mutual recognition. They looked at each other. And then, perhaps it was the afternoon light entering through the Society's high window, perhaps it was the specific quality of a silence shared before something both found genuinely interesting. Something moved in the air between them that had no exact name, but which Claire, observing from the prudent distance she had learned to maintain, recognized with the clarity of someone who had read a great many novels. "You have read about this?" said Harriet. "I have," said Edmund. "My father, the Duke, had an interest in natural history. The Renmore Library has a considerable section." "Considerable how?" 142 volumes. Harriet looked at him with an expression that, in another context, might have been called wonder, and which was in fact the specific wonder of a reader confronted with the number 142. Edmund felt something he had not felt in a long time, the desire to laugh, not the controlled and polished version of laughter expected in society, but the free and mildly absurd laughter of one who realizes that what is happening is simultaneously unexpected and completely right. "You might visit them," he said, "the volumes if you wished." Harriet looked at him for a moment. "Is that an invitation to the library of Wrenmore House?" "It is. It would be a pleasure if you should so desire." She was silent for an instant, and in that silence there was not calculation but genuine consideration, the kind one employs when something matters, and one wishes to be certain the answer is true. "I accept," she said. "Thank you." Outside, that same afternoon, Cyril Ashbourne was having a very different conversation, more private, less decorous, with Lady Venetia Holt, a young and very well-positioned widow who had nursed her own hopes regarding Edmund Wrenmore for 2 years, and who was watching the development of the situation with an anger she kept perfectly concealed beneath an impeccable smile. Cyril and Lady Venetia had interests that, at that particular moment, coincided conveniently. The visit to the Wrenmore House Library took place on 10th April, with all appropriate formality. The Duchess was present, which was simultaneously correct, and, Harriet suspected, deliberate. But the Duchess had the talent of becoming almost invisible when she chose to, settling with her embroidery into an armchair near the fireplace, and making herself as much a part of the environment as the furniture. Harriet moved through the library with that quiet concentration Edmund had learned to recognize as the truest sign of interest she displayed. 2 adults walking among books, speaking about natural history and medicinal plants, and the difference between what Tudor-era scholars knew and what they believed they knew. There was something in that which was simultaneously prosaic and entirely unlike anything Edmund had experienced in a drawing room in 31 years. When she found Turner's Botanical Treatise of 1551 and opened it with the specific care of one who respects old books, Edmund stood watching her hands on the pages, the hands of a woman who had carried practical things, books and notebooks and probably her father's shopping basket, and thought that this was, objectively, the strangest and simplest moment of the entire season. "May I bring my notebook next time?" she asked without raising her eyes from the page. "You may," he said. And in those words, in that next time that neither of them had spoken aloud but both had heard, there was a change in the state of things as real as the yellowed pages of the Turner of 1551. The Duchess, in the armchair by the fireplace, continued embroidering with a composure that was the most refined form of satisfaction. But Mrs. Fenn, in the edition of the 12th April, wrote, "Sources close to the W family confirm that there is genuine though careful interest in the Duchess's matrimonial project. What remains unclear is whether the interest belongs to the son, or merely, as ever, to the mother." It was a convenient and cruel question, and it was read the following morning by Lady Venetia Holt, who cut out the page with a golden pair of scissors and sent it to Cyril Ashbourne with a card that said only, "The moment is now." 2nd fortnight of April. The note arrived for Harriet on a Tuesday morning, delivered by a boy she did not know and whose employer was not identified. It was written in an educated, anonymous hand, and stated that if she had any interest in knowing the truth about the Duke of Wrenmore's intentions, she should present herself at the Whitfields' tea-room in Piccadilly the following day at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. It also stated that the information she would receive would be in her own interest. Harriet read the note, folded it with precision, and went directly to the Thornhill Library, where Claire was writing a letter, and placed it on the writing desk. "What would you do?" she asked. Claire read the note, then read it again. "I would not go alone. I have no intention of going alone." "Would you go to Whitfields before telling the Duke?" Harriet considered this for a moment. "It would depend on what the note wished to show me. If there is something I need to know, I would rather know it before bringing any conclusions to him." "And if it is a trap?" "A trap for what?" "I have nothing that would be worth someone setting a trap for me." Claire looked at her with that expression, which was the adult version of "Harriet, you are cleverer than you think, but sometimes you do not see the obvious things. You are the woman the Duke of Wrenmore is considering as his future Duchess. That is quite something." Harriet was silent. They went to Whitfields, Harriet and Claire, on the Wednesday afternoon, and found Lady Venetia Holt seated at the corner table, with the air of one who knows she controls the situation. She was everything Harriet was not in terms of presentation. Blonde, impeccably dressed in the latest Paris fashion, with the bearing and movements of a woman trained since childhood to be precisely this type of woman. And there was something in her eyes, beneath the studied courtesy, that Harriet identified with the analytical precision she applied to everything. Functional hostility. "Miss Ashbourne," said Lady Venetia with a false smile, "thank you for coming." "You did not sign the note," said Harriet, sitting down. "No, because I knew that if I had, you would not have come." The smile remained. "I am Lady Venetia Holt. We met briefly at the Whitmore dinner." "I remember." Harriet placed her hands in her lap. "What did you wish to tell me?" Lady Venetia drank her tea with the composure of one constructing a scene. "I have known Edmund Renmore for 7 years. Very well." A pause. "He and I reached something of an understanding 2 years ago, which was interrupted by the Duchess's intervention. She never considered me suitable." Another smile, sharper this time. "The Duchess has the habit of intervening in her son's affairs. What happened with Mr. Ashbourne was proof that she also uses third parties for her purposes." Harriet waited. "Your cousin," Lady Venetia continued, "did not act alone in the matter of the negotiations. He was encouraged by the Duchess." The silence that followed had a specific weight. "You are saying the Duchess orchestrated my cousin's negotiations," said Harriet carefully. "I am saying that Mr. Ashbourne received information from the Duchess's side that made the negotiation appealing, informal assurances, nothing that can be proven, of course." Lady Venetia inclined her head with the elegance of one who has done so for years. "I am telling you this because it seems only fair that you should know what kind of matter you are becoming involved in. If you marry Edmund, you will not merely be marrying a man. You will be marrying the Duchess and all the mechanisms she operates." Harriet looked at Lady Venetia for a long moment. There were several layers to this. The information, which might be wholly or partially true, or even calculatedly distorted, the intention, which was clearly to sow doubt, and the underlying question, which was whether there was something here she needed to consider, regardless of the motivations of the person conveying it. "Thank you for the tea," said Harriet, rising, "and for the conversation." Lady Venetia looked at her with an expression that was not quite surprise, but something close to it. "Is that all?" "For now," said Harriet. "I have the habit of verifying information before acting upon it." Claire caught up with her on the Piccadilly pavement, with that hurried step of one trying to keep pace with someone walking faster than the situation appeared to require. "You were not unsettled," said Claire, more statement than question. "I was," said Harriet. "I simply did not show it." She went to speak with Edmund that same afternoon. She did not send a card, did not request a formal appointment. She went to Renmore House and asked the butler to announce her presence, which was, by any reasonable social standard, a rather unusual thing to do. The butler, who had served the family for more than 20 years and had seen many unusual things, made the announcement with impeccable impassivity. Edmund came to the drawing-room with the expression of someone mildly surprised who was actively managing the surprise. "Miss Ashbourne." "I need to ask you a question," said Harriet, who had decided that the direct approach was the only one that made sense. "And I would prefer you to answer with the same honesty you showed in our first conversation." Edmund looked at her for a moment, and then gestured to the butler, who vanished with the discretion of a well-paid ghost. "Sit down." "I prefer to stand for this." She looked at him directly. "Your mother encouraged my cousin's negotiations. Did you know that?" Edmund's silence was different from what she had expected. It was not the silence of someone caught off guard. It was the silence of someone who had just received confirmation of a hypothesis he had already considered, but not yet voiced. "I did not know," he said, "but I am not surprised." Harriet breathed. "Then the question that truly matters is, was the decision made here over these past weeks yours or hers?" Edmund looked at her for a long moment, and Harriet saw something happen in his eyes that she had not seen before. The falling away of a resistance. Not dramatically, not in a single instant, but with the slowness of a wall that yields not from a single blow but from the accumulated weight of time. "It began as hers," he said. "It is no longer." There was so much unsaid in that sentence. Harriet was very still. "I made that first call to prove that my mother did not control me," said Edmund, with an honesty that was costing something and that he was now paying. "I went to the park because you were unexpected. I went to Lady Whitmore's tea because I wanted to go. I invited you to the library because—" He paused, searching for words with the care of someone who rarely needs to search for them because he rarely uses them in this way. "Because I wanted to spend more time with you. Not because there was a plan of mine, despite my mother's plans." Harriet looked at him for a moment that had the specific quality of moments one remembers afterwards, not for what was said, but for what lay beneath everything that was said. "Your mother is an extraordinary woman," she said at last. "Yes," he agreed, with an expression that was half resignation and half involuntary admiration. "And manipulative. That too. And I am still a girl from a clerical family, without a significant dowry, who spent an evening thinking about medicinal plants at the Montague ball while everyone else was dancing." "Yes," said Edmund, "and that continues to be, against all reasonable expectation, precisely what I find most interesting about this conversation. There was something in that which was simultaneously mildly absurd and completely true." Harriet felt that smile arriving without asking permission, the same one from the first day in the drawing-room, and this time she did not control it. "Your mother will keep trying to manage things," she said. He agreed, "without any doubt. And my cousin will keep having plans which he will put into practice without consulting me." He smiled too. "That seems likely. That is a considerable degree of complication for two people who have essentially known each other for 3 weeks." "It is," Edmund agreed. And then, with that specific inflection she had learned to recognize as the signal that he was about to say something that cost him more than it appeared. "But I have the hypothesis that it is worth the complication." The Duchess entered the room at that precise moment, for she had the gift of timing, or because there was a domestic intelligence system that Mortimer administered with formidable efficiency, and found her son and the young Miss Ashbourne in a silence that had the specific quality of something that had just changed. She looked from one to the other. Then she went to her favorite armchair by the window, sat down with the economical elegance that was her hallmark, and said with a composure that was the precise opposite of innocence, "Harriet, my dear. May I call you Harriet? Would you like some tea?" Edmund closed his eyes for an instant. Harriet looked at the Duchess with that analytical expression that had placed her in that room in the first place, and then looked at Edmund, and in both looks, the Duchess's and her son's, there was something different, but which she perceived came from the same place, the place of those who take things seriously, including people. "Yes," said Harriet. "Thank you, ma'am." The Duchess rang the bell with a satisfaction that was, for once, entirely without artifice, and outside the month of April, ordinarily rainy and grey, made way for that specific late afternoon light that occurred sometimes when the clouds yielded, a light that gilded the stone facades and the still new branches of the plane trees and the golden dust the breeze raised from the streets, and that made the city, for a few minutes, exactly as beautiful as it promised to be. Cyril Ashbourne received a letter from the Reverend Thomas Ashbourne that week, a letter written in the clear, direct hand of a man who had chosen his words carefully. He said in substance that unauthorized intervention in his daughter's affairs was incompatible with the respect the family expected of its members, and that Cyril would be welcome to return to Derbyshire when he was ready to conduct himself accordingly. It was gentle. It was absolute. And it was, unmistakably, the voice of Harriet's father saying what needed to be said. Cyril left London on 18th April. Lady Venetia Holt departed for a season on the continent that lasted the remainder of the year, which Mrs. Fenn documented in a sentence and a half, which, by Mrs. Fenn's standards, was almost nothing. On 22nd of April, Edmund did what he had not done in 10 years of social pressure, of seasons, of candidates carefully presented by hopeful mothers and strategic aunts. He proposed. Not in a lit garden, nor at a ball, nor in a setting designed for the purpose. The proposal took place in the Wrenmore House Library, before the Turner of 1551, with the simplicity of one who knows that the most important words require no frame. "I can offer you a library of more than 100 volumes on natural history," he said, and the certainty that I will never need you to be anything other than what you are. Which is, in the most precise terms, I know exactly what I needed, without knowing I needed it. Harriet looked at him for a long moment, with that attentiveness he had learned to read as the highest form of consideration she offered. "And the Duchess?" she asked. "The Duchess will interfere," he said, "always, but she will interfere because she cares, and that, I have learned to distinguish, is different from interfering because she wishes to control." "I have learned to distinguish that too," said Harriet. And in the way she said it, with that simplicity that was her manner of being completely true, there was the answer that none of the following words needed to be spoken, but she said them nonetheless. "Yes, I accept. Renmore Hall, Yorkshire, September 1882. Autumn had arrived at the Yorkshire estate with that specific generosity of the English countryside. The trees in every variation of gold and red, the air with that freshness that was not yet cold, the afternoon light low and long, and the colour of honey. Harriet was at the window with a notebook in her lap and a borrowed volume of the Turner of 1551 from the Renmore House library beside her, and there was in her posture something not unlike what she had been on that evening at the Montague ball, the same concentration, the same thoughts that held her so completely that the world around her required a considerable stimulus to make itself noticed. The considerable stimulus arrived in the form of Edmund, who knocked at the door with the knock of one who knows he is interrupting, but who has assessed the interruption as worthwhile. "My mother wants to know whether you are coming to dinner this evening, or whether we are to send a tray up to the library." Harriet raised her eyes from the notebook. "That would be discourteous." I said as much. She said that discourtesy and intellectual absorption are different circumstances. The smile arrived before she could decide whether she wished to show it. She is not wrong. Edmund came into the room and stood looking out from the same angle she had been looking through the window. The Yorkshire fields in September, the oaks in their autumn colours, the distant horses in the pasture. There was a quality to the silence between them that Harriet had learned to distinguish. Not the silence of things unsaid, but the silence of things sufficiently said. The silence of two people who share a space without needing to fill every moment with words. "Dr. Caldwell wrote," she said after a moment, "a new specimen has arrived, a Flemish herbarium from the early 16th century that may predate the Turner. Earlier than the Turner of 1551? So he says. He wishes me to come to London to examine it." Edmund looked at her sideways. "When?" "October," he suggests. "We can go in October." There was something in that "we," in that simple and entirely natural word, that made all the difference between before and after everything that had happened in those 6 months. Harriet closed the notebook and looked at her husband with that attentiveness that was the truest form in which she could look at the things that mattered. "Your mother will want to come," she said. "My mother will always want to go wherever we go," said Edmund, with that inflection that was resignation and affection in exactly the right proportion, "and we shall always decide what makes sense. That seems a reasonable policy for the next 50 years. It is the minimum that seems appropriate to me." A letter had arrived the previous week in the firm, recognizable hand of the Reverend Thomas Ashbourne. It was brief, as his letters always were. A few lines that said everything that needed to be said and nothing that did not. He wrote that the Derbyshire parish was well. That autumn had come early that year, and that he had found in the parish library a treatise on medieval botany that he thought his daughter might wish to examine on her next visit. At the end, a single line. "I hope Renmore Hall is, for you, the sort of place where one thinks well." Harriet had folded the letter carefully and kept it inside the notebook she now held in her lap. Her father did not need to say more than that. From below, from the great dining hall of Renmore Hall, came the distant sound of the Duchess arranging the table with that soft efficiency that was her way of caring. For Edmund, for Harriet, for the great and ancient house that kept the books and the paintings and the years of all who had lived there before and those who would come after. Harriet rose from the window and carefully tucked the Turner between the notebook's pages. She took her husband's hand with the simplicity of one who does so because she wishes to, not because she must, and together they went towards the hall where the Duchess awaited them, with tea and with the satisfaction of one who planted a seed and watched, grow something far better than she had planned. Because sometimes the stories that begin in the most discreet corner of a ballroom, with a young woman who only wanted to think about medicinal plants, and a card delivered by an efficient secretary, arrive exactly where they need to arrive. Not by accident, not by strategy, but by the slow and absolutely inevitable weight of two people who decided to be honest with each other. And in the most discreet corner of the Montague ballroom, had anyone paid attention that March evening, they would have seen a very small and very important thing happen. A woman who was not trying to be found, being seen by the one who needed to see her. The rest was merely consequence. The story of Harriet and Edmund takes place in Victorian England, at a moment when the country was living through one of the most contradictory phases in its history. It was 1882, and Queen Victoria had reigned for 45 years over the greatest empire in the world, an empire that dictated fashion, customs and morality to much of the planet. London society was rigidly hierarchical. The aristocracy dominated the drawing rooms, the parliaments, and the decisions that shaped the country, while the middle class grew with the force of the Industrial Revolution and began timidly to question old structures. For women, however, options remained brutally limited. Marrying well was, for most, the only way to secure safety and social standing. A young woman without a significant dowry, like Harriet, depended on the London season to be seen, evaluated, and if she were lucky, chosen. The balls were not merely entertainment, they were markets. Mothers arrived with carefully drawn strategies, daughters arrived in dresses that represented months of savings, and eligible men arrived, when they appeared at all, with the awareness that every step was observed and documented by society entire. The social columns of the periodicals of the era, precursors of the gossip journalism we know today, transformed a simple encounter into a public event. The figure of the Duke, in this context, was almost mythical. The title of Duke represented the apex of British nobility, second only to the royal family, and carried with it enormous responsibilities, estates spread across entire counties, hundreds of dependents, a lineage that had to be preserved. Edmund Renmore was not merely a wealthy man, he was an institution, and Harriet was a clergyman's daughter. The distance between the two worlds was, by the standards of the era, almost insurmountable. Almost. Harriet had never gone to the ball to be chosen, and it was precisely that which made her unforgettable. There is something profoundly true in this story, the idea that the most solid love is born not from performance, but from authenticity. Harriet did not pretend, did not calculate, did not shape herself to what was expected of her. And Edmund, accustomed to an entire world trying to impress him, recognized in her something he had forgotten existed, a person who was simply what she was. The central message of this story is not about dukes or dowries, not about London seasons or drawing-room intrigues. It is about a far simpler and far more difficult choice, to be honest in a society that rewards the mask. Two stubborn hearts discovered that their resistance was not weakness. It was the protection of something they did not yet have a name to call. And when they finally yielded, for they yielded in truth. Tell us in the comments, what did you think of this story? Were you rooting for Harriet from the very first chapter, or was it Edmund who won you over? The channel team thanks you for your company. Until the next story, and may it hold you from beginning to end.